Good morning, sir. Good morning, classmate. Today, let's tackle about Israel police system. Dito, malalaman natin ang mga police system ng Israel at kung may pagkakaparehas ba sila sa police system ng Pilipinas. As you can see on the slide, on the left side, makikita nyo itong star na to, which is represent yan ng Star of the David, and very important yan para sa mga Jewish people. Ito naman sa right side, makikita nyo naman dito yung logo of Israel Police, which is meron na naman yung Star of the David, which is maraming inire-represent hindi lamang sa kanilang bansa kundi pati sa mga tao doon. Inire-represent din ito yung mga tao at yung tradisyon ng mga Jewish people. At ito naman yung sa nakapalibot sa logo nila, made of wood yan. It represents yearning of peace or kapayapaan. Tulad sa Pilipinas, ang flag ay may sinisimbolo. Yung red, sinisimbolo niya ng the red is represent blood, spirit of freedom and independence, yung kalayaan. And blue naman, sinisimbolize yung patriotism and justice. At ang white naman sa flag ng Pilipinas is sinisimbolize ang purity or kalinisan. At ang tatlong star ay sinisimbolize as Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. Let's proceed to the short details about the country Israel. Israel is known as a small country with a relatively diverse topography, or diverse topography is known as pabago-bagong klima. Ganon din sa Pilipinas, may pabago-bagong klima, taglamig, winter, summer, ganyan, etc. Ang language ng mga Israelita is Hebreo, and we will tackle later about kung paano napalitan and na-translate, I should say, yung Hebreo into English language para mas tiyak na maunawaan ng mas nakakarami. Kasi halos yun na yung language ng buong mundo, worldwide, which is the English language. And when it comes to ranking, Israel is known as most innovative country. Kamakailan lang, noong 2019, ang Israel ay nag-rank bilang pang-fifth of the most innovative country, which is pagdating pala sa innovation is pambato ang Israel at magaling sila. Israel is the country in the world that has more trees today. At kilala din ang Israel bilang isa sa may pinakamaraming puno sa buong bansa. Marami din silang museum na maaring mapasyalan. Tulad din sa Pilipinas, may mga museum na maaari ding mapasyalan. Doon din nagsimula yung voicemail technology. Doon na-develop sa Israel. Ang gagaling ng mga Israelita, magaling sila mag-develop and mag-innovate ng mga new products na maaaring magamit nila. Okay, let's proceed to the overview of police system in Israel. Name of police agency is Israel Police Agency, while in the Philippines is Philippine National Police, also known as the PNP. Sa department naman is Ministry of Public Security, which is Israel Police include it. Diyan belongs. While in the Philippines naman is the PNP is belong to the DILG, or the Department of Interior and Local Government. PNP, BJMP, etc. Sa ranks naman tayo, Police Commissioner General as the highest, Constable naman as the lowest. While in the Philippines, under the new rank classification RA 11200, the highest rank is the Police General, in the lowest rank is the Patrolmen or Patrolwomen. Ito naman ang kanilang motto: Military Police, People First. While in the Philippines, ang kanilang motto naman is to serve and protect. As you can see on the picture, in-insure talaga nila yung public safety, traffic, para ma-lessen ang crime. Mas inuuna talaga nila ang kapakanan ng mga tao kaysa sa kanilang sarili, kasi yun yung kanilang motto. Sa type of law enforcement naman is centralized, the same also with the Philippines, which is a centralized law enforcement. Why centralized law enforcement? Because iisa lamang ang nag-e-exist na agency, which is Israel Police Agency. The same also with the Philippines, na iisa lamang ang nag-e-exist na agency, which is the Philippine National Police from Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao. Iisa lamang ang nag-e-exist. The same also with the Israel Police na iisa lamang, which is the Israel Police Agency. Punta naman tayo dito sa estimated strength. Ang estimated strength nila is 35,000. Ang 35,000 na ito is yan yung professional police. Sila yung mga nagsasahod. Ito, sila yung mga nagsasahod, and 70,000 civil guard volunteers. As you can see, mas marami ang bilang ng mga volunteers kaysa sa mga nagsasahod. Ang ginagawa ng mga civil guard volunteer is sila yung mga nagpapatrolya sa kanilang streets, para sa ganun is maiwasan nila ang possible crime na mangyayari. Let's proceed to the short history of police system in Israel. At the beginning of 19th century, establishment of Hamashumer organization. Itong Hamashumer is one of organization exists in the 19th century. Ang mga membro nito is kinilala nila ang kanilang mga sarili, or dineclared nila ang kanilang mga sarili bilang Hebrew Police Force to protect the Jewish or Hudyo from Arab riots. And establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Ito naman, at the year 1948, ang Israel ay na-establish as an state kasi independent dati ang Israel. During the 1960s, systematic organization changes. Noong 1960s naman, nagkaroon na siya ng organizational changes, which is when it comes to ranks, naiayon na siya sa during the time na kung anong meron sila. Yun na yung mas sinunod nila. And let's proceed to the Ministry of Public Security in the year 1977. Noong 1977, the Ministry of Public Security is nag-evolve kung saan kinabibilangan na ng Israel Police. Dito na nakabilang yung Israel Intelligence Forces, etc. At saka nung taong 1948, dito rin na-establish ang Israel Police. At as I said a while ago, responsible sila for public security. And noon pa man is meron na talagang civilian guard or yung mga volunteers, hindi sila nagsasahod at sila ay voluntaryong nagwagwardya para sa protection ng kanilang mga nasasakupan, which is sa ngayon is mas marami pang volunteer guard kaysa sa mga sumasahod. Yan yung history na nakalap ko base sa aking paghahanap ng datos patungkol sa Israel. Another information about the policing system of the Israel. So operational units, may tinatawag sila na border police, which is ito yung responsible sa combat arm, and mainly serve in unquiet areas. Sila yung mga nandoon sa mga unquiet. When you say unquiet, hindi tahimik or hindi safety na lugar, sabihin na lang natin. Sila yung mga responsible na police dito. The border police has both professional officers. Ang mga border police is sila yung mga professional, alam nila kung anong dapat gawin, responsible sa mga training, alam nila mga tactics about sa mga action na gagawin nila. At hindi pwedeng pumasok dyan ang mga voluntary police na sabi ko nga kanina na mas marami ang bilang. Hindi sila pwedeng pumasok dyan kasi mas mabigat na mission para sa kanila ang nakaatang. Dito naman sa Yanam, or ito makikita niyo sa picture, yan ang tawag sa mga officer na full gear during raid training, armed with M4A1 rifles and operating police dog K9. Sila yung mga may dalang aso, mga K9 dogs na sa Pilipinas, sila yung mga naghahanap ng mga drugs, illegal drugs na maaari may bit-bit ng isang tao. Sila yung mga responsible para doon. Ang acronym ng YAMAM is Special Police Unit. It is the Police Elite Counter-Terror State Rescue Unit. Siguro ang equivalent nito sa Pilipinas is sila yung mga SWAT, na kung saan pag may mga hostage, sila yung mga talagang tinatawag to rescue the victim. At it is known as one of the most experienced and specialized in the world. Sila yung may mas experience and specialized na sila pagdating sa mga ganitong kaganapan. Let's proceed. Dito naman sa YASAM is the one called counter-terror unit in each district. The units originally started at riot police. Ito, as you can see, makikita niyo yung dalawang riot police na nakasakay sa motor vehicle na ang tawag dyan ay YASAM Patrol on A BMW F800 JS in Jerusalem. Sila yung mga nagpapatrol sa daan. Halimbawa may mga riots, one call lang sila at magre-respond din na agad. Sila yung responsible para doon. Mabilisan lang yan kaya yung gamit nila is motorcycle. Ito na ang sa operational unit is nakabilang dito ang the National Traffic Police, which is sila yung mga sa picture na ito, sila yung mga in charge sa pagmamando ng trapiko, and divided into 5 regional district and a national patrol unit. Na i-divide sila sa 5 regional district. Hiwa-hiwalay, and yung sa Pilipinas, ang nagmamando ng trapiko, ang in charge ay the HPG or the Highway Patrol Group. Dito naman sa Israel, ang in charge sa pagmamando ng trapiko is National Traffic Police. Para sa ganun is maiwasan yung any crimes possible to happen. Dito naman, itong nakikita yung picture na ito, itong malaking building is the Lahab 433, which is the Police Office Unit for Investigation of National Crimes and Corruption. Dito na ipupunta ang mga kaso sa national crimes, especially yung mga corruption. Hindi may iwasan yun. Sa isang bansa, hindi mawawala ang corruption. Kahit sa ang bansa pa yan, meron at merong corruption. Kung sa ibang bansa, talamak ang corruption, sa Israel, meron at meron din. Sa Pilipinas, hindi may pagkakaila ay laganap pa rin ang corruption, which is kinabibilangan pa ng mga matataas na opisyalis ng bansa. Dito sa Lahab, dito na idadala ang mga files na kung saan iniimbestagahan nila in a equal treatment of law. Na-establish ito noong January 1, 2018, or also known as the Israeli FBI. The unit is the merger of the 5 law enforcement offices into one. Ito yung pinaka-offices nila at kinabibilangan ng Minister of Public Security, at ito siya. Ang Minister of Public Security is siya ang namamahala dito, which is nandyan na lahat ng Israeli police, lahat-lahat ng forces. Okay, let's proceed to the organizational structure of IP, Israel Police. But as you can see, walang naka-specify na organizational from the highest to lowest, unlike with the Philippines na meron siya naka-specify. Itong nakikita niyong Israel Police is under siya ng Ministry of Public Security at meron siyang sangay from Minister Security Secretariat, Director General, the Israel Police or Israel Prison Service, the Anti-Drug and Alcohol Authority. Under naman sa Director General is meron siyang dalawang sangay. Ito yung Israel Fire and Rescue Authority, Witness Protection Authority. Okay, let's proceed to the Deputy Director General of Administration and Human Resources. Itong kanyang sangay ang apat. The Human Resources, Logistic and Acquisition, the Training and Social Affairs. Dito naman sa Deputy Director General of Operation and Supervision is meron siyang tatlo. The Security Division, the IT Department, Firearm Licensing Department, and proceed naman tayo dito sa Deputy Director General of Planning, Budgeting and Monitoring. Meron siyang tatlong sangay ang Planning, Budgeting and Monitoring. Dito naman sa Deputy Director General is meron siyang mga sangay na 5. Ang Policy and Strategic Planning Department, Chief Scientist, International Relation, Emergency Preparedness, Community and Crime Prevention, meron siyang 3. Ang City Without Violence, Mitsila, Municipal Policing. Dito naman sa right side, meron yung 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Merong 6 na nakalagay sa organizational structure, which is the legal advisor, police and prison personnel at ombudsman, the accounting, international auditing and public complaints, the land law enforcement in the Egypt, and the spokesperson. Another information, the Israel is wala silang municipal police, unlike with the Philippines na from national, regional, district, municipal, meron silang mga police na meron silang headquarters, but in the Israel is wala silang ganun. Kumbaga, ang Israel Police is naka-assign into different various kung saan na sila ilagay ng kanilang mas nakakataas ng kanilang commissioner. Unlike with the Philippines na example sa Itiaga is merong headquarters, merong masasaklolohan. Example, ang mga Itiagueños is may krimen na nangyari is mas malapit nilang matawag ang pulis kasi sa municipal nila is may nakatalaga or may naka-assign na headquarters. Proceed naman tayo dito sa recruitment. Sa recruitment is meron siyang 3 stages. Sa first stage is recruiting office reviews the incoming resumes according to the available vacancies, the candidate background, residence, etc. Sa first stage is kailangang i-review nila yung resumes if you have criminal records. Para sa ganun is malalaman nila kung with a good moral character ka ba. And then, the candidate background. Siyempre, kung ano yung background mo, kung saan ka nakatira at kung saan ka matatagpuan, siyempre. Kung saan ka pinanganak, saan ka nakatira sa kasalukuyan, kailangan nilang i-review yun. At ang second stage is ito, aerobic test, 1,000 run, required time for completion 6.5 minutes or less. Abdominal muscles set-ups or at least 33 set-ups. Arm muscles, push-up para mas mapalakas yung or matest nila kung gaano nga ba kalakas or katibay ang iyong katawan. Dito nila itetest yung pagiging physically fit mo. Push-up at least 22. Yan ang second stage, and the third stage is itong pangatlo, a successful candidate will be invited for the security officer talk. May invite ka to talk face to face. Tatanungin ka, tatanungin ka ng mga sikretong usapan lamang, yung kayo-kayo lang, para sa ganun is if you have, kapag makapasa ka nga ba sa ganung test nila. Kaya dadaan ka muna sa pagsubok in 3 stages. According to the police law, each policeman is recruited for a period of 5 years only. The first 24 months following the recruitment shall serve as a trial period, which is intended to test the policeman's sustainability for the job and for service. Ayun nga sabi ko kanina, para matest kayo. Hindi lamang yung inyong sarili, kumbaga, matest rin kayo kung nararapat ba kayo as a police, kung makakapasok sa police job na yan. Okay, let's proceed to the qualification to enter the Israel Police. Number 1 is citizen of the Israel. Before you enter the Israel Police is kailangan ay isa kang citizen of Israel. The same also with the Philippines, na kailangan citizen of the Philippines ka rin, para sa ganun is makapasok ka sa pagiging police. Dapat with a 4 years course. The same also with the Philippines, na kailangan mo rin ng 4 years course and 6 months training. Willing to undergo 6 months training. Ito ang qualification sa pag-apply sa IP. I think the same also with the Philippines, na kailangan graduate ka ng 4 years course and you are willing to undergo 6 months of training. And also you have a good moral character. Syempre, sa pag-apply mo sa IP, kailangan ay meron kang good moral character. Hindi ka pwedeng pumasok na may criminal records ka or kahit na or violent behavior. The same also with the Philippines, na dapat with good moral character ka. And another information sa Philippines is kapag may tattoo ka, hindi ka pwedeng pumasok sa police unless saka ka lang nagkatato kapag nasa katungkulan ka na. And next is dapat physically fit ka rin. Hindi ka naman pwedeng pumasok sa IP kung ikaw ay not physically fit, and or halimbawa may opera ka, kaka-opera mo, or hindi gaanong kalakasan ang iyong katawan. The same also with the Philippines, na dapat physically fit ka. Kasi hindi naman pwedeng sumaba ka sa training, lanta ang iyong katawan, or malnutrition, kumbaga, abnormal ang iyong mga muscles or what. Kaya dapat physically fit ka pa rin. And sa height naman, not be classified, but in the Philippines, ang height nila is, ang height qualification is 5'4" for male and 5'2" for female. But meron silang parang ipinapasang batas na decreasing the height qualification, which is ang height ng babae is 4'9" and sa lalaki is 5 flat, which is sana maaprubahan upang sa ganon is maraming makapasok na gusto pero kulang lamang ang kanilang height. When it comes to age qualification is, ang age qualification naman to enter the IP is not less than 21 years old and not more than 30 years old. Yung age qualification is the same also with the Philippines, na dapat hindi ka bababa ng 21 years old at hindi ka rin lalagpas ng 30 years old. Okay, let's proceed to the firearms, weapon, and equipment of the Israel. As you can see on the pictures, makikita nyo yung iba't ibang firearms, weapon ng mga Israel police. Ang kanilang weapon is the ayan, gumagamit din sila ng ganyan, grenades, stun grenades are the second most predominant crowd control weapon, in the additional to tear gas. Yan yung kanilang ginagawa para makontrol nila yung mga halimbawa, mga kaguluhan, crowd, mga kaguluhan, mga protesta, yan yung mga ginagamit nila. In additional to tear gas. Tsaka sa kanilang firearms naman, gumagamit sila ng mga M1 carbine, Glock, which is meron tayo sa Pilipinas, the M16 or M4, which is meron din tayong ganyan dito sa Pilipinas. Ito, makikita nyo yung kanilang iba't ibang klase ng firearms. The carbine type, caliber 5.56 mm or also known as the M4. Itong M4 is meron din yan dito sa Pilipinas. The Glock or meron din tayo niyan. Glock M4, the carbine type, caliber .30 or the M1. Pero wala tayo niyang ganyan dito sa Pilipinas. Itong meron sa atin, the rifle, caliber 5.56 mm or also known as the M16, which is ito ang lagi natin nakikita sa mga kapulisan na dala-dala nila na naka sa may shoulder nila, dala-dala nila. Additional, kinuha ko rin itong Star Canyon, which is massive bore and struck barrel looking exterior. Ito yung canyon na meron ang Israel, which is gamit ng mga military nila yan. Another, ito naman sa handgun is meron silang M1911 pistol manufactured in 1914, the Soviet double tip pistol manufactured in 1937. Itong mga to is meron sa Israel. The modern handgun, Glock 22, Glock 21, yan, meron silang iba't ibang uri ng handgun. Sa kanilang sniper naman is meron silang M1903. Let's proceed to the equipment. Sa equipment naman ng Israel is meron silang security car patrol, the police patrol, or meron din tayong ganyan. Sa kasalukuyan ay ginagamit ng ating mga kapulisan sa pagrorondalya. The police motorcycle. Itong police motorcycle is mostly ginagamit nila kapag emergency na. Kapag mabilisan, ito yung kanilang ginagamit. Especially pag sa mga crowd control, ito yung kanilang ginagamit. And then the tank of Israel. Sa gyera naman ng Israel, as you can see, makikita nyo yung flag ng Israel dyan. Itong kanilang ginagamit na tanke. And this one also. Ito naman ang police bomb squad vehicle. Ito naman ang kanilang ginagamit. As you can see, makikita nyo yung flag ng Israel dito sa likod niya. The Israel police uniform. Dito naman makikita nyo yung iba't ibang type ng Israel uniform. The dark blue in the left side and the navy blue in the sky blue, I should say, in the right side. Sa Pilipinas naman, meron din silang iba't ibang type ng uniform. Meron yung type A, type B, according sa kanilang gagawin. Halimbawa, sa paglilinis, which is iba ang kanilang uniform na naka-short sila and naka-police na damit. Sa opisina, iba rin ang kanilang uniform. Proceed naman tayo dito sa Israel Police Insignia. Sinalin nila sa English ang Hebrew language, which is para maintindihan. Ang pinaka lowest rank is equivalent to constable or the shooter. Yan ang pinaka lowest rank. And the highest rank is the commissioner. Yan yung pinakamataas na rank nila sa Israel Police. While in the Philippines, sabi ko nga kanina, base sa new rank classification under the RA 11200 na the highest rank is the police general and the lowest rank is the patrolman and patrol women. Wala na dati yung PO1, PO2 na yung dati ang nakasanayan, pero ngayon is nabaguhan na siya. Okay, proceed naman tayo dito sa best practices ng Israel Police. Dito naman is the RAND Corporation is sponsored by the Israel Police, which is itong RAND Corporation is a non-profit institution that helps improve policy. Itong RAND Corporation is dinevelop or in-sponsored ng Israel Ministry of Public Security para sa ganun ay ma-improve yung kanilang policy to be implemented. Para sa ganun is magkaroon ng lesser crime na mangyayari or mabawasan ang krimen na possible na mangyayari. Kaya naitayo yung RAND Corporation. As you can see on the picture, makikita nyo yung naka-uniform ng brown or what color is this? And this one is the Israel Police, as you can see naman sa kanilang logo na nakalagay sa kanilang sa may braso. Makikita nyo dyan na sila ay naki-cooperate or nag-visit sila sa Israel Police to train, para ma-training, to learn techniques and best practices, para matutunan nila ang mga techniques at kung ano nga ba ang mga best practices ng Israel Police to counter terrorists, managing low intensity, iba't ibang paraan para makontrol ang krimen. Magaling sila sa racial profiling, crowd control. Diyan the best ang mga Israel Police. Another information is Israel Police is known as the world counter-terrorism expert. Sila ay pinakamagaling at dinadayo sila ng iba't ibang police officer para lamang matuto. Sa next slide ko is may papanood akong video na kung saan is makikita nyo ang kanilang practices na maaaring ma-adapt ng Pilipinas para sa ganun ay magkaroon din ng kumbaga maayos na pag-manage sa mga kaguluhan.
U.S. police are training in Israel, and that's something every American should be concerned about. As protests sweep across the U.S., it's becoming increasingly clear that law enforcement has become more militarized, treating the people they're supposed to serve and protect as a hostile foreign population. Part of the reason why is that since the 90s, and especially after 9/11, U.S. law enforcement, including police departments, the FBI, CIA, and immigration officials, have been trained by Israeli agents.
These exchange programs are exacerbating the violence in both places and lifting up the Israeli occupation as a global gold standard for policing.
And communities of color in the U.S. are disproportionately paying the price.
Police, since its origins, have been a racist, brutalized body. But through time, their efforts of brutalization have taken on new character. That new character is police exchanges.
Hey everyone, I'm Dina, and as a Palestinian-American journalist who's reported from the occupied West Bank, put the camera down. Okay. I witnessed firsthand how Israel routinely targets unarmed Palestinians with force as part of its decades-long illegal military occupation of Palestinian land. I've also seen the militarized U.S. response to peaceful protesters in places like Standing Rock. And in this historic moment of uprisings in the U.S., the parallels between how American and Israeli forces crack down on civilians are more glaring than ever. So why is U.S. law enforcement receiving training from Israel, a flagrant human rights offender? And what does it mean for people on the ground? Now, it's important to keep in mind that the U.S. police and military have historically brutalized communities of color and repressed movements for justice well before the existence of Israel. But now they're building on that by learning from a state that has mastered racial profiling, crowd control, and surveillance. To understand why these trainings are so problematic, you first need some background about how Israel systematically dehumanizes the Palestinian population it completely controls. Israel's creation in 1948 enshrined a nationalist policy of Jewish Israeli supremacy at the expense of the native Palestinian population, most of whom were forced to flee their homes, becoming permanent refugees. In 1967, Israel began its repressive military occupation of what remained of Palestinian land, subjugating the entire Palestinian population, denying them the rights of citizenship, and crushing any dissent against its policies. Since then, Israeli forces have routinely fired tear gas, skunk water, rubber-coated steel bullets, and even live ammunition at unarmed protesters. So this is a state that violently controls and suppresses the rights of an occupied people, and U.S. police are learning its tactics to use against American citizens. Thousands of law enforcement officials from all corners of the country have traveled to Israel to learn police strategies and exchange tactics. These trips became increasingly common after 9/11 as pro-Israel groups used the so-called War on Terror as an opportunity to push for a closer, unconditional alliance with Israel, which had marketed itself as the world's leading counterterrorism expert.
On these trips, high-ranking U.S. officials are visiting Israeli checkpoints and prisons, places where human rights groups all over the world have documented Israeli discrimination and repression and torture and killing of Palestinians.
I spoke to Stephanie Fox from the Jewish Voice for Peace. Her organization was part of a campaign called Deadly Exchange, which outlines the dangerous consequences of U.S. police trainings in Israel.
Why do you think Israel is so attractive to U.S. law enforcement agencies?
U.S. policing has always been both about enacting a war on Black and brown communities in the U.S. and around the world. So I think that the two being both rooted in racism and state violence, there's a real natural attraction and a desire to trade tactics.
So who runs these exchanges? They're organized by pro-Israel groups like the Anti-Defamation League, which calls itself the world's leading anti-hate organization. The trips are funded privately as well as through grants from the Israeli and U.S. governments, including the Justice Department. The ADL boasts that they've trained more than 15,000 law enforcement professionals and have sent more than 200 high-ranking U.S. officials to Israel. And some officers fresh off these trips have high praise.
This was an outstanding experience, something that I'll remember for the rest of my life. Obviously given us a lot to think about, a lot of best practices.
This is, in fact, the finest training initiative that I've ever been a participant in.
But we've seen the ramifications of these trainings here in the U.S., with police departments treating American citizens who are exercising their constitutional right to protest as though they're under occupation, especially communities of color. Take Ferguson, Missouri, for example. After the 2014 police killing of Michael Brown, the officers' response to protesters mirrored some of the tactics used by Israeli forces against Palestinians, which civil rights icon Angela Davis has drawn attention to.
The tear gas that was being used in occupied Palestine was the same tear gas that was being used in Ferguson.
And she's right. Officers in Ferguson used the same U.S. manufactured tear gas and flashbang devices to disperse crowds that Israeli forces regularly use against Palestinians. But that's not all. In 2011, the sheriff of St. Louis County, where Ferguson is located, traveled to Israel on one of the ADL-sponsored police exchange trips. And then, 3 years after the Ferguson uprisings, which catapulted the Black Lives Matter movement to the international stage, the city's police chief also traveled to Israel for training. He said he was blessed to be part of the exchange. And throughout all of this, Palestinians have recognized the shared struggle, even tweeting support and tips to American protesters. But Ferguson is just one example. Other cities and counties where officers have received Israeli training later became the sites of high-profile police killings. That includes Hennepin County, home to Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed by police, and Atlanta, where Rayshard Brooks was fatally shot by an officer. And who could forget the militarized response to protesters in Washington, D.C. after the death of George Floyd? Officers from several agencies, including the U.S. Park Police, fired on protesters with tear gas and flashbangs. And it turns out that many officers from D.C. traveled to Israel for training, including the U.S. Park Police chief and a police commander. And then there's surveillance. Israel's massive surveillance system has inspired U.S. officials so much so that after a former police chief visited Israel in 2008, this city adopted its techniques.
Our video integration center in downtown Atlanta is modeled after the command and control center I saw in the old city of Jerusalem.
Atlanta has installed over 10,000 surveillance cameras, which have raised serious privacy concerns. But to really get a sense of Israeli inspiration, look no further than New York City. After 9/11, the NYPD and the CIA created a sprawling covert spying operation that surveilled and infiltrated mosques and Muslim neighborhoods in the New York City area. This led to widespread and unprecedented profiling of the region's Muslim communities. A police official official told the Associated Press that the program was modeled in part off of how Israelis spy on Palestinians in the West Bank. That program was heavily scrutinized in the U.S., but widespread surveillance of citizens continues today. During recent protests, U.S. officials surveilled demonstrations in 15 cities using drones and helicopters. They recorded almost 300 hours of footage, which federal agencies and local police departments across the country can access. But it's not just the U.S. that's learning and implementing new strategies at home. In 2016, Israel copied New York City's highly controversial and racist police policy of stop and frisk. The Israeli version primarily targeted young Palestinian men who were detained and searched without probable cause. All that said, a few communities have stood up to these police exchanges and won. In 2018, Durham, North Carolina became the first U.S. city to ban its police from training in Israel. I spoke to Ajam Abdullahunt, a student and activist with Black Youth Project 100 who campaigned to make this happen.
I saw the interconnectedness between Black and Palestinian struggles. Because the United States and the state of Israel continue to strengthen their relationship, I think oppressed people within both of those places must also strengthen our relationship.
In 2014, the NAACP had called the Durham Police Department a broken system in need of repair due to a troubling pattern of racial profiling and police brutality. And guess what? The department also had a history of training in Israel. The current police chief had previously headed Atlanta's Israel Police Exchange program during her time with that department, so activists wanted to stop her from doing the same thing in Durham. Other communities have also successfully put an end to these trainings, including Northampton, Massachusetts, and the state of Vermont. But Ajamu says even though the win in Durham was exciting, racist policing isn't over.
So while we got a major victory, we really have to look at the struggle and the exchanges as part of a larger struggle to build a society where police are no longer necessary. And I hope this current period of rebellion represents a new era of Black and Palestinian solidarity.
Israel's occupation is illegal under international law and is premised on denying basic rights to the millions of Palestinians that Israeli forces control. Is that who we want American police, who are already in need of so much improvement, to be learning from? What do you guys think?
Okay, let's proceed to the last slides of my presentation. Other details, Civil Guard. This refers to a volunteer organization of Israeli citizens which assist in daily police work. As I said a while ago, sila yung mga volunteer civil guard na nagbabantay sa mga streets. Sila ay walang sahod. The national headquarters of the Israel Police is ito siya, yung nakikita nyo sa picture na matatagpuan sa Jerusalem. Another details is Israel Police is known as the world's leading counter-terrorism expert. Pagdating sa mga counter-terrorism, pinaka-expert dyan ang mga Israel Police. Kaya nga sa video kanina nakita nyo na dinadayo sila ng mga iba't ibang law enforcement para magpaturo ng mga iba't ibang techniques kung paano nila na-manage ang ganung uri ng terrorism sa kanilang bansa. Hopefully sa discussion ko is may natutunan kayo kahit papano, and sana sa mga natutunan nyo is manatili sa inyong isipan na maaring pwede nating ma-adapt as a future law enforcement someday. Ito lamang po, and thank you. Have a nice day. God bless us all.